In this video, I'm going to be discussing three of my absolute favorite Right Bank Bordeaux producers, Conseillante, Angelus, and Belair-Monange. I had the opportunity to visit each of these outstanding producers a couple of months ago, so in this video, I'm going to share what I learned while I visited. Located in Palmerol, Conseillante is a historic producer that traces its roots way back to the 1750s. This makes it one of the oldest estates in all of Palmerol. It's also one of my favorites, in large part because it produces wines of extreme elegance and finesse. Conseillante has around 12.5 hectares of vines. These vines have historically been planted to 80% Merlot and 20% Cabernet Franc. Recently, however, Conseillante has been increasing the percentages of Cabernet Franc, and they even planted a parcel of Cabernet Sauvignon that could be utilized in the wine as early as 2025. So going forward, we can expect that the blend for Conseillante will be 70% Merlot, around 25% Cabernet Franc, and perhaps 5% of Cabernet Sauvignon. The Conseillante vines are located in a prestigious area, as its neighbors include Chateau Petrus and L'Avangile. Interestingly, around 30% of Conseillante's vines are located in Saint-Emilion near Cheval Blanc. Conseillante has been using some sustainable farming techniques and gradually converting to organic principles. Every year, a larger percentage of its vines are farmed organically. Conseillante completed a massive renovation of its winery in time for the 2012 vintage. They have a unique circular-shaped winery. They also added a number of concrete vats back then, and this allows them to use parcel-by-parcel vinification, which gives them more precision with their winemaking. Interestingly, Conseillante has also been experimenting with vinifying some of their wine in oak barrels. This started with 6% or so back in 2015, and they were pleased with the results, so they've increased this to around 9% or so. It seems like this vinification in oak gives them a little bit more texture in the wines. Conseillante's wines are typically matured in 70% new French oak, 27% of barrels that have one previous use, and around 3% in amphora. Interestingly, Conseillante is one of the very few Right Bank producers that blends shortly after malolactic fermentation is completed and long before bottling. As mentioned, the thing I really love about the Conseillante wines is that they're wines of elegance and finesse, with silky tannins and velvety texture. These are not the most powerful wines in Palmerol, nor the ripest, but they're perhaps the most elegant and well-balanced. These are extremely sensuous wines, and wines that you definitely have to taste if you haven't done so previously. Conseillante wines typically include flavors and aromas of black cherry, black raspberry, plum, and violets. In fact, this violet descriptor is so well established that Conseillante even has a violet color on its label. Conseillante has been absolutely firing on all cylinders lately. Some of my favorite vintages for Conseillante include 2015, 2016, 2018, 19, and 20. But perhaps two of my absolute favorite vintages are 2022 and 2023. The 2022 vintage should be hitting store shelves soon, and this is a potentially triple 100-point wine. They absolutely crushed it in 2022. This wine will sell for a little bit more than some other vintages of Conseillante, but I think it will be well worth it in the long run. I've seen this one selling for around $300 a bottle or so in the United States. The 2023 vintage is also a potentially perfect wine. I had a chance to get an early read on this wine during my recent visit to the winery. And you can find this one selling on futures for quite a bit less than the 2022 vintage. This one will be closer to $200 or so. But again, it's a wine that I highly recommend. If you're looking for older vintages of Conseillante, some of my favorites include 1990, which was absolutely phenomenal, and 1998. I've also had some mixed results with the 2020 vintage. That one was previously a little bit closed and shut down, but about 6 months ago, this wine seemed to turn a corner a little bit, and some of the more recent bottles that I've tasted have been much more vibrant and expressive, and they appear to be emerging from their slumber. The name for Chateau Angelus was inspired by a common everyday event. On a daily basis, the workers in the nearby vineyards in Saint-Emilion would hear the sound of bells ringing from 3 local churches. That sound inspired the now famous name for Chateau Angelus, as well as its logo and a sculpture in the backyard of the estate. Chateau Angelus has been one of the very best producers in Bordeaux, and especially in Saint-Emilion on Bordeaux's Right Bank, since at least 1989. Before that, it was definitely a bit of an underachiever, so I would be careful buying any vintages that predate 1989. The tremendous improvements in quality at Angelus in 1989 were driven by the implementation of a number of improvements both in the vineyard and in the winery. Examples include parcel-by-parcel vinification and farming, green harvesting to reduce yields, harvesting later in the growing season so that they could harvest perfectly ripe berries, and also using a much more strict selection of fruit. In the winery, Angelus began to ferment whole berries, oak barrels were used for malolactic fermentation, and they began to mature the wines in 100% new French oak. While these techniques are all commonplace today, Angelus was very much a front-runner back in the late 1980s when it started to implement these techniques. While most Right Bank Bordeaux producers are dominant in Merlot, Angelus was one of the earliest proponents of Cabernet Franc, and that's certainly reflected both in the vineyard and in the final blend. Angelus has 42 hectares of vines that are planted to 50% Merlot, 47% Cabernet Franc, and 3% Cabernet Sauvignon. As you might expect, the Angelus Merlot is planted in soils that have clay and limestone, whereas the Cabernet Franc is planted on soils that are more gravel, limestone, and sand. Angelus began to use organic farming techniques in 2018 and was certified organic beginning with the 2021 vintage. Angelus continues to emphasize a strict selection of fruit for its wines. They embrace optical sorting equipment, but they don't stop there, as once the optical sorting is completed, they also do a separate manual selection just to make sure the optical sorting equipment didn't miss anything. Angelus continues to mature its wines in 100% new French oak for between 18 to 24 months depending on the vintage. Significantly, the first 8 months of this maturation is on the lees, which helps to extract a little bit more color, texture, and richness. It's always a treat to taste Chateau Angelus. This is a rich, full-bodied, concentrated wine, but it's also a wine with opulent, luscious fruit. Flavors and aromas include dark, spicy fruit, licorice, and truffle. It's capable of aging for decades. In fact, the tremendous 1990 Angelus is one of my all-time favorite Right Bank wines. Every year, I do a video with my top 25 wines for the past year, and the 1990 Angelus has made the top 15 on a couple different occasions in recent years. An example of the blend for Chateau Angelus is the 2022 vintage. This is an exceptional effort from Angelus in perhaps one of their best all-time wines. This wine is a blend that consists of 60% Merlot and 40% Cabernet Franc. The 2022 Angelus should be arriving on store shelves soon. It received tremendous critical acclaim. This one sells for right around $475 per bottle or so. So if you're a fan of Angelus, that's definitely one you'll want to add to your collection. Some of my other favorite vintages of Angelus, besides 1990, include the 2000, 2003, 2005, 2008, 9, and 10, 2012, and then 2015 and 16, 2018, 19, and 20. So you really can't go wrong with any of those vintages. While I was at the winery, I also tried the 2011 vintage. While this isn't one of the more highly acclaimed vintages for Angelus, it's a wine that's very enjoyable and which is in a nice window for drinking currently. So if that's something you have in your cellar, you might want to give it a try in the near term. During my visit, I learned that Angelus was also in the midst of a complete overhaul of its winemaking facilities. Among other things, they're going to be installing a gravity flow system, which should help to improve the wines even further down the road. In addition to its top wine, Angelus also has an excellent second wine that it's been making since 1987. Carillon d'Angelus is a wine that's typically a Merlot-dominant blend, often about 90% or so, and then there's smaller amounts of Cabernet Franc and sometimes a little bit of Cabernet Sauvignon as well. For example, I tried the 2019 vintage at the winery, and that was a blend that consisted of 90% Merlot and 10% Cabernet Franc. The fruit for this wine comes from a variety of sources, not just from the fruit that's around the estate, but sometimes fruit from two other sectors as well. This is wine that has a bit more of a red fruit profile. It's much more approachable than the top wine, and it's one that you can enjoy a few years after release, and it will certainly age well in your cellar for up to 12 to 15 years or so. The 2022 vintage is one that will sell for around $120 per bottle, so you can get about 4 bottles of this second wine for the price of 1 bottle of the top wine. If you're interested in wine recommendations, wine collecting strategies, and learning more about wine, please do subscribe to my channel. I've been collecting wine for more than 15 years and also have a level 4 diploma from the WSET. So I have both formal certification as well as substantial practical knowledge from the School of Hard Knocks. Wouldn't it be nice if you were able to purchase one of the very best wines in all of Saint-Emilion on Bordeaux's Right Bank for between $150 and $240, depending on the vintage? With wines like Cheval Blanc, Ozone, and Chateau Angelus selling for between $400 and $700 per bottle, that may seem like it's beyond reach and not realistic. However, one of my biggest discoveries from my trip to Bordeaux will give you that very opportunity. I'd had a couple of wines from this producer in the past and was extremely impressed, but I definitely wanted to learn more. This is a producer that was founded back in the 14th century and had historically been one of the more revered estates on Bordeaux's Right Bank. However, it was a bit of a reverse alchemist, turning gold into dross and producing wine that was not nearly up to the level of quality that you'd expect for a producer that had a number of vineyard sources right on the limestone plateau next to Ozone and very close to Cheval Blanc. Fortunately, however, Christian Moex and his family acquired this producer in 2008. You're definitely familiar with some of the other Moex family wines, as they also own Petrus, Les Fleurs Petrus, Trotanois, and Dominus Estate in Napa Valley. So they certainly know what they're doing. The Moex family immediately got down to work and began to improve the wines dramatically, even in the first vintage that they produced in 2008. Among other things, they started harvesting later and using a much more stringent selection. Later, they began replanting the vineyards, and they also recently completed a state-of-the-art winery. The result is some wines that certainly rival the quality of some of its bigger-name brethren that sell with much larger price points. For that reason, I'm definitely a buyer of Chateau Belair-Monange in 2025. If you're looking for vintage recommendations, you can definitely buy any vintage since 2008, and they'll be pretty good quality. However, the quality keeps improving each and every vintage, and some of the more recent vintages are definitely some of the best. I'm particularly excited about 2018, 19, and 20. In fact, I tasted the 2018 vintage at the James Suckling event last June and was extremely impressed. And at the winery, I tasted the 2020, and despite its youth, it was absolutely exceptional, with layered flavors of blackcurrant and plum, and also some intriguing floral notes. This wine had silky texture and a very, very long finish. It was already extremely enjoyable despite its youth. 2021 will be a bit of a down vintage, but still one that's well worth considering, and it will be a little bit lower priced as well. Even if you don't seek out and stock up on back vintages, I would absolutely be a buyer of this wine going forward, at least beginning with the 2022 vintage, as quality for this wine will only continue to head north as these replanted vines gain some additional age and the winemaking team further refines their blend. They're currently shooting for around 98% Merlot and 2% Cabernet Franc. This is a wine that I fully expect within 8 to 10 years will be certainly one that's discussed routinely as being at the same quality level as Cheval Blanc, Angelus, and Ozone, and one that will sell for much closer to their price points as well. So you definitely want to load up on it while you can, and while this wine sells for between $150 and $240 per bottle, depending on vintage. 2022 is potentially one of the best ever vintages for Bordeaux, and the wines are starting to hit store shelves now. If you'd like to learn more about this potentially epic vintage and my thoughts regarding some of the best wines to purchase from that vintage, please be sure to check out this video that's linked above.